It's been 10 days since Ukrainian forces invaded Russia. Ukraine says it has made constant gains in Russia, and now it claims over 1,100 square kilometers of Russian territory and claims to have seized about 82 Russian settlements. It has been pulling down Russian flags in the area as well, and Ukraine claims to have set up a military administrative office in Russia's western Kursk region. Now, this is from the first day of the incursion. Even before Ukraine acknowledged it, we've been expecting a massive Russian response. But what is Russia waiting for? What's Russia's game plan? To discuss this further, we're being joined by Dr. Diesen, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southeastern Norway and editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Glenn, always a pleasure speaking with you on Russia-Ukraine matters. Welcome to Game Plan. I wanted to start off by this, that UK has joined US and Germany in allowing Ukraine to use its arms inside Russia. What do you think Russia is waiting for?
Well, they're definitely supporting the invasion of Russian territory now, which is also a very risky move on behalf of these NATO countries. But I think for the West, the goal is obviously boost morale in Ukraine, also sell the war to the Western public that this can be won, so there will be more weapons and funds. It's also a good opportunity for maneuver warfare because they can then hit Russia in the deep rear and disrupt its logistics and also divert Russian troops from Donbass. So, there can even be formation of cauldrons or even seizing the Kursk nuclear power plant. That being said, I think what Russia will likely do now is just start to stabilize the front line. And I expect that Russia will focus on attrition because this is all territory. If the territory is weakly defended, there's no good position, then this can end up being very negative for the Ukrainians. So the main goal of Russia now will be to knock out the Ukrainian and NATO weaponry, which has been invading Russia, and then begin to push them back. So meanwhile, I think, that for this reason, the adventure into Kursk could come at great cost of Ukraine because they diverted resource from the south. So Russia's taking advantage of this by storming towards Pokrovsk, which is this crucial transportation hub. And meanwhile, I think that they're looking for maximum attrition in Kursk. But obviously, this surprised them. But they will push back, I expect, over the following week.
Glenn, I wanted to, just get your thoughts on this, and I will just put it as bluntly as possible here. Do you think it's possible for Russia to get the Ukrainians out, or will they just have to eliminate the soldiers who are there on Russian territory at this point? We're talking about one of the world's strongest militaries at this point, and they were caught off guard by the Ukrainians. They walked right in, and it's been 10 days. What do you think Russia is going to do now to set that example as well, that you don't come into our territory? And of course, Russia has already invaded Ukraine, but they can't have this. And with every passing day, it's going to be more difficult for Russia to just make this pass off as a small hiccup in their war against Ukraine.
No, that's correct. And I think that, it's important for them to first strike all these small mobile forces, because if you look at the territorial conquest, it looks very impressive because it's a lot of territory. But the way the Ukrainians have done it is because they attacked a poorly defended area. They use a lot of these small mobile forces before they send in larger forces. So I think what you're going to see is Russia's going to force them to either draw in more troops there. For example, as we see now with building the trenches, this is important to reduce maneuver warfare because then the Ukrainians will need to send in larger groups of forces, and that makes them more exposed. So I think this will be the main thing: stabilize the front line, push them out, but as well, this invasion of Ukrainian territory, also with the support of the West, obviously this is going to have a big response as well. So at the moment, I think they're focusing on stabilizing the front lines, knocking out the Ukrainian weaponry before pushing them back. But I don't think in the West we thought this one properly through, what it means to invade Russia. And I think the consequence could come at much more hostile, for example, indiscriminate bombing of cities, taking out political leadership in Kiev. And also it makes it more legitimate to start targeting directly against NATO. So I think we're walking this whole military adventure is very risky, but it's on many different levels.
Glenn, Russia already invaded Ukraine, and that happened in 2022. At this point, to give a befitting reply of sorts, or perhaps to secure its front lines, and then after that to set an example, what next can Russia do? Is it only left with the option to invade NATO territory after this? Because it's already in Ukraine. So what does it do after this?
Well, they wouldn't invade NATO territory. Again, I think this is part of the mistake in the narrative, this idea that Russia is going to take NATO after Ukraine. But again, look how one of the biggest weaknesses or complaints in Russia against Putin has been that he's been too restrained, that effectively with every NATO escalation, that is longer distance weapons striking deeper in Russia and now supporting the invasion of Russian territory, that this is an expression of weakness, that they're emboldening the adversary. But it is a good question, because this is a little bit like what happened when Iran was struck. We're putting immense pressure on Russia now to restore its deterrence, because we're effectively telling the Russians we can do anything we want. The Americans even suggested, hey, if the Ukrainians want to strike Moscow, there's nothing to do with us. So this is a way of greenlighting it. So at some point, Russia has to restore its deterrent, and this will require some kind of a strike against something vital to NATO. As we've seen in the past, Russia restricted itself to saying they will supply weapons to NATO adversaries. They did a weapons deal with the North Koreans. They sail their warships into Cuba. But what I hear now is that obviously the West didn't get the message. So now Russia will have to step up the way it responds to NATO's escalation. So again, very dangerous territory we're moving into.
Glenn, I just want to, to highlight something that I mentioned earlier, and perhaps, if you can focus a little more on that. The longer this incursion lasts, the more embarrassing it's going to be for a military power like Russia, for a nation like Ukraine. Russia believes it couldn't have done this without the backing of the West. Several minds think the same. But I wanted to understand from you, at this point, every passing day that those Ukrainian troops are there in Russian territory, what kind of an impact does it have on Russia's mindset and Russia's reputation also on the global scale?
Well, I think first of all you're correct, but again, NATO's been, especially the US, has been heavily involved in this war ever since, from the first day after they toppled the government in 2014. This is by the Americans' admission themselves. That's when it began. But again, the US and NATO has been supporting with the training, the military equipment, ammunition, military planning, intelligence, managing some of the weapon systems, even target selection. So there's simply no way that NATO did not participate in this planning of the invasion of Russia. So what I suspect is that the American satellites likely discovered some poorly defended region in Kursk, and they saw an opportunity. And we now see these American officials in the media saying they don't know what Ukraine is doing, and they've been calling them to find out. But again, this is very obviously theatrics, because they do not want to be held accountable until they know what the Russian reaction is to breaking this, another red line. And but of course, it is embarrassing for the Russian government that they let this happen and lost so much territory. And but on the other hand, it also kind of proves to much of the Russian public what they've been saying, which was a justification for the war to begin with, that this was seen as being a NATO provocation, a NATO attack on Russia, which began, again, a decade ago. So this narrative is now strengthened. And furthermore, it's also worth looking at the optics, because while in the West we tend to hope that this will humiliate Putin and cause less support, but instead we see a lot of public opinion now mobilized in support of the government. Because again, look at the optics. We see now Germany again supporting the invasion of Russia. Its military leaders are saying this is an operation which warrants more military equipment to support the invasion. We see Ukrainian battalions like Nachtigall, which is named after battalions of Nazi Germany in World War II. And on Russian TV, the scenes we see with some of these troops wearing Nazi insignia on their uniforms and even taunting civilians before killing them. I mean, this is what you will see on Russian TV screens now. So I'm not sure if this will cause people to turn on Putin and the Kremlin instead. I suspect there will be more pressure building on Putin because to do something, not just against take a harder line against Ukraine, but also NATO, because there's really a sea of anger now in Russia. And while we might hope in the West this will be directed towards the Kremlin, I think it will be directed against us. And they're asking why the Kremlin has been so restrained. Why are there no consequences when its red lines are breached? So I think it might not be the reaction here in NATO which we had hoped for.
Glenn, I think it was on the 6th of August that was the first time we carried this report of Ukrainian troops inside Russian territory, Russia carrying out evacuations from that region. And the number of voices we had on our channel, they were all mostly telling us that most people are scratching their heads with what Ukraine plans to do here. What do you think they're going to be doing? Why have they done this? Because this is at a time when neither Zelensky nor anyone else from Ukraine had acknowledged the attack. Now, I wanted to ask you, what does Kyiv possibly plan to do from here? Do they plan to invade further into Russia? Do they really want to put their hand inside the lion's mouth? Or do they want to now retrieve, or just they've made their point, now they want to head back?
Well, if they leave now, it could also be an embarrassment for Ukraine, because across the rest of the front line, go to the Ukrainian Telegram channel or listen to the interviews by some of their military leaders. Many people are perplexed. Why did they send all of this military equipment into Kursk, where a lot of it's being knocked out? Meanwhile, in the rest of the front line, they're lacking manpower, ammunition, and the military equipment. And this is why, for example, Pokrovsk seems to be heading towards collapse now. So it comes at a great cost for Ukraine as well. So it begs the question, what is this for? And again, some people suggesting, like Zelensky, that they might use this territory in Kursk to negotiate a territory swap with the Russians, but that's obviously not going to happen. If anything, this has made the Russians much less compromising. And some are suggesting they could take the Kursk nuclear power plant and trade it for the Zaporozhye one. But again, this is also very unlikely. I think because the Ukrainians are using a lot of the small mobile forces, it's not going to be able to to take a strategic target like this. Otherwise, again, I think they were hoping that the Russians would do the same, divert troops from the front line in Donbass. But given that they're not doing it, this might be a staring contest, whoever blinks, because whoever has to send their troops to support, the Russians has to support Kursk, the Ukrainians have to support Pokrovsk. Whoever sends their troops first might be seen to lose. But overall, I think the Russians have much more manpower, so they're able to, I think, manage this much better. So again, with this huge excitement in the media at the moment here in the West about this invasion of Russia, I think we're ignoring the huge costs, and that is that the front lines of the rest of the front line is now heavily undermanned, and the Russians are taking huge advantage. But just as a final comment, Kursk, it could go either way. If the Ukrainians are able to cause some collapse in the deep rear, this could be a huge victory. Otherwise, if they lose all their manpower and equipment and are chased out again, this will be effectively the last gasp of the Ukrainian military, perhaps. So it's a very, very risky move, which can go both ways. Which also explains, I guess, why the UK, US, and the Germans are now throwing their full support, both military and political, behind this invasion of Russia.
Well, at this point, Ukraine, and backed by the West, has pretty much tried everything. They've thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, toward the Russians. Perhaps this was like this last-ditch effort before the US elections, because after that, perhaps things can go in a very different direction. Of course, that is something we will need to wait and watch. As of now, this blinking contest does wait. We need to wait and watch who blinks first, as you mentioned it earlier. That was Glenn Diesen, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southeastern Norway, joining us on Game Plan. Thank you so much, Glenn. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Shivan.